Yeah, hello everybody. I'll try to share my screen now. Okay. For the next 10 minutes, I will, as Esther mentioned, I will set out our demands. If I get this going here. Yeah. Okay. I want to start actually by giving the Commission a bit of credit. Because what we see now actually with this directive is to a certain extent a paradigm shift if we compare it to the crisis management 10 years ago in 2008, 2009, because it's a clear acknowledgement that the new approach is no longer based on austerity and wage moderation as it used to be, which also included cuts of minimum wages or freezes of minimum wages and public sector wages and the dismantling of collective bargaining. The approach this time is different. It's an acknowledgement that wages are not just cost factors. It's an acknowledgement that they are actually an essential part of people's income, and that they can boost internal demand and as such be a main driver of an inclusive recovery. So, and that also involves collective bargaining as a tool to establish fair wages as a part of an inclusive recovery. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that the directive can be part of it, but it needs improvements to fulfill that role. And I think the key measure we should use to assess this directive is whether it really improves the conditions of workers, and not only in the long term, but also in the short term, because only then this directive will be more than political symbolism. Now, what kind of improvements do we want? We've heard very impressively how low the minimum wage in some countries is and that it is not enough to make a living. Now, what we ask for is the inclusion of a double decency threshold in the main body of the directive of 60% of the median and 50% of the average gross wage. Now, what we are not saying is that minimum wages should be set at that level. I think the example of Bulgaria showed very impressively that this may not be enough. What we say is that no minimum wage should be paid below this level. So this is basically a first step, and then beyond this minimum threshold, we have to ensure the adequacy of statutory minimum wages to ensure a decent standard of living. So it's basically a staged approach. Now, I skip that one. 60% of the median and 50% of the average. Now, let's have a look how the different countries share in this respect. This is data from the OECD earnings database. And we can see that only in Slovenia and France, both criteria are fulfilled. So if we get this into the main body of the directive, this would lead to improvements in the majority of the countries. I don't want to go into detail here, but I want to once again highlight that we are not saying that the minimum wages should be set at this level. This is the bare minimum. Below this, nothing should be paid. Actually, I have chosen Bulgaria as one of the examples to illustrate that we have to go one step further in terms of a living wage, actually, to ensure a decent living and to ensure adequacy of minimum wages. And here the situation in Bulgaria was the minimum wage in 2020 was 610 leva. So if we had improved or increased the minimum wage to the 50% of the average, which is one essential criteria of the double decency threshold, it would have had to be 683 leva. But then based on a calculation of the basket on goods of services and of goods and services, the actual living wage for a family of 2 wage earners and 1 kid should have been 1,200 leva. And this shows that the threshold of decency is different from adequacy. We have to distinguish the two. And other examples, Ireland and the UK. In Ireland and the UK, a living wage is calculated on a regular basis, and that also shows that the living wage is much higher than the actual minimum wage. In Ireland, the difference is, we have heard the minimum wage is 10.20. The living wage that has been calculated would be 12.30. So that's the distinctions. Now, what other improvements do we want to see? I think it's essential that no group of workers is excluded from the scope of the directive. Many countries have sub-minimum rates for young workers. But we have heard from some of the country studies in Poland, for instance, employees on civil contracts are excluded, and this needs to stop. Every worker has to have, who earns a minimum wage, should be able to lead a decent life. Then no deductions in many countries, or many employers deduct the costs for uniforms or for breakage, and I think that's impossible. And then a very important point, extra payments, for example, bonuses for shift work, night work, overtime, holiday pay, that needs to be made on top of the minimum wage. In many countries, this is included in the calculation of the minimum wage, so this needs to be on top. And then, of course, the directive, one objective of the directive is also to establish a uniform set of criteria for the adjustment of minimum wages. And there we have to ensure that these criteria cannot be used to bring minimum wages down. And what I mean by this, I will illustrate by one criteria that is currently included in the criteria is productivity. And our aim is to eliminate productivity from these adjustment criteria, and for two reasons. One reason is that we argue that adequate minimum wages from which you can make a decent living are a human right. So this is independent from economic considerations. That's the first argument. But the second argument has to do with productivity as a concept. I mean, there are various reasons. First of all, it's not specified what kind of productivity do we actually look at. Company level, sectoral level, productivity of the economy as a whole. Secondly, how do you measure productivity in certain sectors? I mean, we have heard that many minimum wage earners in Ireland, for instance, we heard are in the service sector. How do you measure productivity of a care worker, of a child carer, of a nurse? I mean, it's very difficult to measure productivity. And then a very important argument linked to the first one, that the criteria should not bring down minimum wages. What happens if we have negative productivity, as it can happen in some economic circumstances? Does that mean that minimum wages have to go down then? I mean, and for that reason, we also ask for a non-regression clause, which means that minimum wages should never be lowered. It should be ensured that they are not be lowered. And what is very important is we also ask for the full involvement of the bargaining parties in setting the statutory minimum wage, because it is very important that unions are part of the whole process. In many countries, in particular in Central and Eastern European countries, we have the formal procedures for union involvement, but this is fake. This is a token involvement, because at the end of the day, the state unilaterally sets the minimum wage. So in that respect, full involvement of the bargaining parties in setting the statutory minimum wage has to be ensured. Okay. And I want to leave it at that, Esther. I hope I was within the time limit.
Not only were you within your time, but my goodness, you just have this ability to explain things so clearly. I want to now go over to